Now, I want to introduce Gabriella Grant. Gabriella has been a longtime friend at this agency, and she has helped us along the road to become trauma informed.
Thank you, Deanna. Would you like a hug? Very moving story. And I've got a personal story too, which is that when I started doing this work in 2006 to work with 94 domestic violence shelter agencies. Raise your hand if you work for a domestic violence shelter agency. Nice to see you all here. I was listening to NPR. Raise your hand if you listen to NPR. I was listening to NPR, and they were handing out the Nobel Peace Prizes, the ones in Oslo. And NPR asked people to call in and do a People's Choice Nobel Peace Prize. And so they were actually saying on NPR who, with the recording of the person who nominated the People's Choice Nobel Peace Prize. And somebody here in Los Angeles called into NPR national headquarters and nominated Ruth Beaglehole at the Center for Nonviolent Parenting and Education. And I said, the Center for Nonviolent Parenting and Education? And I called. And I said, Ruth, I've got this project to work with domestic violence shelter agencies, and let's work together. And we have been working together ever since. So People's Choice Nobel Peace Prize Award winner, 2007, Ruth Beaglehole. And I am here to talk to you about what we can call trauma-informed rules. For those of you who heard Ruth or know Ruth, rules and structure may not seem like they fit well with nonviolent parenting, but I'm going to suggest actually that they are essential. And that to be trauma-informed and to create trauma-informed rules, we actually have a mantra. Are they clear? Are they warm? And that is what we're going to strive to be with our rules, our agreements, our guidelines, any other word you want to use for what we're about to talk about. Are they clear? Are they warm? And what I work with systems involved recipients of social services. And so for those of you who are not working with systems involved social service recipients, if you're parents yourselves, I'm going to invite you to think about your own house rules, your own homework rules, and clean room rules. And let me know, and indeed let the people at ECHO know if this information is helpful in the home as well as in agencies. So I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say. So in my experience, when I went into 94 domestic violence shelter agencies throughout the state of California, was that the rules, if they were clear, they were not warm. And in some of the shelters where they strive to create more warmth, the rules weren't clear. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to actually try to create rules that are both, at least attempting to be both clear and warm. And therefore, what I'm going to suggest, equally important, is that there's structure, but it's a responsive structure. Structure and responsive. If it's working, great. If it's not working, let's change it up. The not working rule gives us permission to make changes. So I'm going to actually ask all of you to think about your rules. And let's say you might not have any kids, or you might not be working right now, or your kids are old. Your own rules can be clear and warm, structured and responsive as well. So what I'm going to ask you to do is briefly, with a neighbor, on your own, don't do it, Twitter, Facebook, do whatever it is that you want to do during this next minute or two, discuss a commonly broken rule. This rule is already broken. It's commonly broken in your agency, in your home, and what I'd like you to do is write it down exactly as you communicate it to your child, as you tell it to yourself, I will never eat gluten food, or as it's written in your policies and procedures. So just a quick minute to contemplate rules in your own life. All right. We will come back to your rule at the end. So what I'd like you to consider first is that the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, which was the focus of the keynote last year, Dr. Vince Felitti, the study of Kaiser Permanente, 17,000 members that showed dramatic number of adverse childhood experiences in the general population. and showed a strong causal or correlated contribution of adverse childhood experiences to the development of a whole bunch of mental, behavioral, and physical health problems, began by becoming curious and interested in non-compliant patients of a weight loss clinic. Perhaps one of the most important studies that we have began because instead of dismissing the dropouts, they became curious and interested in what the dropouts had to say. And therefore, I'm going to suggest to you that the dropouts, the non-compliant clients, the oppositional children, the treatment failures have an infinite amount of useful information that we can choose to learn from, or we can punish them, discard them, abandon them, and learn nothing at all. So it is actually in the folks that are not obedient, in the folks who are not compliant, that we have a lot to learn from. And you know, one of the ways that we can even understand how we can even understand trauma is that trauma is a chronic or pervasive or maybe even episodic lack of safety. That trauma is the absence of safety. And therefore, if we want to reduce trauma, we are going to have to do what? Create, add, bring in, and emphasize safety. And that's going to be really the bulk of what I speak about today. Judith Herman says in her book, Trauma and Recovery, that trauma is disempowering and disconnecting. It's disempowering to the individual that's undergoing the trauma because they're not able to protect themselves. They're not able to respond. They're not able to prevent. They're not able to manage. But it's also disconnecting because in most cases, at least for what we're talking about, developmental trauma disorder, complex trauma, somebody else is doing it to the victim, to me. So that's pretty disconnecting. Human beings have the capacity, I've just learned, to do terrible things to each other. And nobody seems to be protecting me either. So not only is this human being doing these things to me, other human beings are not noticing, responding, protecting, or preventing this. So trauma, as a result, develops a sense of disempowerment, lack of confidence in self, but also lack of confidence in anybody else too. Who was there? Who will help? Nobody. And in that gap, people engage in a lot of behaviors that often seem like they're non-productive, that they're unsafe, they're counterproductive, but they're serving a purpose. They're giving someone, at least momentarily or temporarily, some sort of power, some sort of connection. So we're going to really look and see that it is what's not working that turns out to be very, very informative. Not just, oh, good girl, the way that Deanna talked about just a little bit earlier. Oh, she's a good girl, everything is going fine. And then when the good girl turns into a bad girl, what happened? You know, where did my good girl go? We're kind of surprised. So therefore, if we're going to create safety, what we really want to focus on is empowerment of the individual. Increasing this person's ability to have confidence in themselves, to handle emerging situations. And increasing connection, that they're developing the ability to connect to themselves in order to then to connect to somebody else. Who is up to them? And we're also going to recognize that trauma affects compliance, and we've got some really good research that shows us this. So the non-compliant behavior is telling us a trauma story. I don't have to wait until the child tells me about the child's sexual abuse or the physical abuse or the neglect or the witnessing domestic violence in the home of origin or the abandonment of the parent. The non-compliance in and of itself is telling me this trauma story. And what we see, for example, in this study, that post-traumatic stress disorder was associated with medication non-adherence independent of psychiatric and medical comorbidities. So the non-compliant, the people who weren't taking their meds, what explains most accurately why they weren't doing that was the presence of post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma in the background. For people who are living with HIV, PTSD, the diagnosis of trauma, whether related directly to HIV or some other cause, negatively affects functioning, adherence to medications, and level of depression. So when people aren't doing what they are supposed to be doing, there is a reason for it, and I'm going to suggest that we can just say it was trauma. We don't have to hear the trauma story. When we look at children who have been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, how many folks here have worked with a child diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder? What we see is that trauma is very prevalent. That the very diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder is telling us that there is a trauma history in the background. I don't actually have to hear the trauma disclosure. I don't have to force the trauma disclosure. I don't have to make the child tell me something that the child does not want to or is unable to tell me in order to know that there's trauma in the background. The research says that, depending on what kind of trauma we're talking about, between 48 to 73% of children diagnosed with ODD have experienced traumatic physical maltreatment. And an additional 1/3 or so have experienced sexual maltreatment. These are of the ones who disclosed, of the ones actually disclosing these histories. Children diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder compared to children with an adjustment disorder diagnosis, so that's the two comparison groups here. Those with oppositional defiant disorder have more historical exposure to maltreatment, more severe hyperarousal symptoms, worse overall psychopathology, and poor social competence. And there's some ADHD in the mix in that category as well. And what the research has also shown is that verbal hostility particularly predicted toddler symptoms associated with affective, hyperactive, and oppositional defiant disorders. Verbal hostility, which wouldn't even meet a PTSD diagnosis of trauma. And that mothers who had experienced interpersonal trauma were more likely to have authoritarian parenting style, verbal hostility, physical coercion, and low nurturance. So we often say, oh, okay, if trauma is the issue, then it's the mother or the parent or the caregiver that's creating the problem. But that problematic parenting behavior is also telling us that there was a trauma history in the background. Again, I don't have to hear the disclosure, force the disclosure, coerce the disclosure, need the disclosure to understand this. The poor parenting, the verbal hostility, the use of authoritarian parenting style is telling me the trauma history. Not in your handouts, I added this just today. Bessel van der Kolk, in his paper, which I highly recommend on developmental trauma disorder, says, many problems of traumatized children can be understood as efforts to minimize objective threat and to regulate their emotional distress. Unless caregivers understand the nature of such reenactments, they are liable to label the child as oppositional, rebellious, unmotivated, or antisocial. How many people here have worked with a child who has been labeled oppositional, rebellious, unmotivated, or antisocial? Who here has been labeled one of those things? Here's another interesting fact. This is in a study on parenting infants and toddlers 0 to 3 survey. 43% of parents think children can control their emotions by age 3. 20% of parents expect children can control their emotions by age 2. So this expectation, we can see, leads to understanding behavior in a way that is not accurate or helpful or safe. I'm 45 years old and I have a hard time controlling my emotions. Traumatized and stressed children often unconsciously respond with survival behaviors that include defiant behaviors. So with that brief review of the research, I think we've got a pretty good research and evidence basis to say that defiance, rule breaking, opposition, non-compliance is a sign and a symptom of trauma. It's telling us a story. It's not the problem. But that's not usually how, at least traditionally, we think about things. We think it's the defiance that's the problem. It's the rule breaking that's the problem. So what I'm going to suggest to you, echoing what Janina Fisher talked about yesterday and what Bruce Perry talks about in his neurosequential model of therapeutics for children, is that we need to be neurosequential. We need to work with children and indeed with our own brains, not against them. Not by thinking what should happen, what I want to happen, what I need to happen, but what can happen, how things actually work. And Bruce Perry says that in order to be neurosequential, to go along with the brain rather than against the brain, to rewire the brain towards safety, as opposed to enforcing the wiring of that child's brain to a malevolent world, the way that Janina Fisher talked about yesterday, Bruce Perry says that we first need to focus on the poorly organized brainstem and diencephalon and related issues connected to self-regulation, attention, arousal, and impulsivity. So how much of your work, what percentage of your work is related to addressing issues of poor self-regulation, attention, arousal, and impulsivity? 100%. Any other percents? Any lower than 100%? 80%? Anybody 50%? I've never heard lower than 50%, frankly. But the lowest I heard was one little yeah at 80%. So if it's 100%, then we need to 100% stay in this zone. If it's 80%, we need to 80% stay in this zone. And Bruce Perry says, and he's pretty open, using any variety. So the creativity limits are up to us. Any variety of patterned, repetitive, somatosensory, which means using your 5 senses, patterned, repetitive, somatosensory activities to provide these brain areas patterned neural activation necessary for reorganization. And it turns out he recommends some fun stuff. Music, that's fun. Movement, that's fun too. Yoga with breath. Not just breathing, but action and breathing together. Not sitting still and breathing, sit and deeply breathe, but move and breathe. Drumming. That's what all those drum circles are doing. They are repatterning the brainstem and the diencephalon. And therapeutic massage in order to repattern. So that sounds like pretty fun stuff, if you ask me. And as a matter of fact, let's try it right now. Everybody, on a voluntary basis, you do not have to do this if you don't want to. Extend your arms out in front of you. Squeeze those hands into fists. Breathe. And shake out those fists. Feeling better? Take those shoulders, squeeze them up. Feel that tension. Breathe, squeeze. And drop your shoulders. Rotating back. Rotating forward. Feeling different in your brainstem? Yeah, let's just keep doing this. 100%, just let's stay right here. Feels good. And Bruce Perry says that only after an individual is able to have at least some ability to self-regulate, pay attention, manage arousal, and be a little bit less impulsive, have a little bit of a delay reaction, do we then move up to the next stage. Therapeutic or interventional work can then move to a more relational-related issues, addressing the limbic or social part of the brain. And he suggests more traditional, although I'm going to suggest they're not actually that traditional, play and art therapy, getting along with other people, doing things with somebody else, achieving a task with another person, hanging out and doing some sort of social activity. To improve fundamental dyadic relational skills. So it turns out that I have to self-regulate before I can interrelate. If I can't self-regulate people, I cannot interrelate. But a lot of people are hoping that by interrelating, this person will help me self-regulate. And rather than developing this own capacity of myself to self-regulate, I give this person the power over my own regulation. Now, when we are an infant, obviously that's the case. I need my caregiver to help me regulate. But if I did not get that early caregiver attunement to help me self-regulate, I'm just going to have to learn to self-regulate myself. I'm going to have to reparent myself. And then I self-regulate. So if I'm working with 2 5-year-old boys and they're playing a game, and one boy starts winning, and the boy who's starting to lose is getting agitated and flicks the board at the other boy and stomps off, Is this an interpersonal problem between these two boys? Nope. It's a self-regulatory problem of the person who had the outburst. But once an individual is able to at least somewhat self-regulate, then they can work on interrelating, tolerating the risk of interrelating. Then we have cogitation. Therapeutic or interventional techniques can then be more verbal and insight-oriented, using the cortical part of the brain. And Bruce Perry's very open here, using any variety of cognitive, behavioral, psychodynamic, insight, cognitive kind of approaches. Now, let's look at our current interventionist approach. What percentage do most interventions spend here? 100. Not neurosequential. We have to go, as Jadina Fisher said yesterday, from bottom up, with ourselves, with our children, with our clients, with our neighbors, with our partners, from bottom up. And Bessel van der Kolk says, it's not in your notes, I just added it in today, he says, only after children develop the capacity to focus on pleasurable activities without becoming disorganized, do they have a chance to develop the capacity to play with other children, engage in simple group activities, and deal with more complex issues. Not the capacity to focus on the trauma, or the control, or the rule, or the obedience, or all these things that we usually design our programs to focus on, but only after children develop the capacity to focus on pleasurable activities without getting disorganized. That we actually want to help kids be able to have fun, to regulate their own emotions. As Janina Fisher talked about yesterday, that window of tolerance. We want to open up that window of tolerance that includes fun. Sounds fun. This trauma business might be not nearly as depressing as we've all thought it was. And this neurosequential model goes along with Judith Herman, Janina Fisher's mentor, who wrote the book Trauma and Recovery. And for those of you who are not already familiar with it, Judith Herman suggests that most people tend to go through 3 phases of trauma recovery. Not everybody, but most. And what she says is that the first stage of trauma recovery is establishing physical and emotional safety, reducing unsafe behaviors, reducing trauma symptoms, increasing self-care, increasing safe coping, increasing self-regulation in the present. The first stage of trauma recovery is present-focused, establishing post-trauma, post-chaos, post-upheaval safety. And that is where most of our publicly funded programs need to be oriented towards, establishing physical and emotional safety. Judith Herman says that then, and only then, safe in the present, is an individual able to safely go back in the past. Well, let's think about it for a second. If I'm a kid or an adult, I mean, it really doesn't matter who I'm working with or who I am. If I'm a kid or an adult and I'm not safe in the present, and I go back in the past where there was trauma and danger and damage, and it's overwhelming and difficult, and then I come back to a present that is equally as unstable and unsafe, it's not going to be good. So it is actually only when safety has been achieved, or at least can be created on a relatively regular and predictable basis in the present, is it indicated to even go back in the past. And Janina Fisher yesterday definitely talked about present orientation for trauma treatment. But once stable, once safe in the present, many people get great awareness, compassion for themselves as little children, going back in the past, reconstructing traumatic memories, understanding some of the traumatic beliefs, and being able to rework and re-believe non-traumatically. So for example, let's say I was sexually abused as a child, safe in the present, I go back in the past, later in life, and I see that, you know, the perpetrator said, it's your fault. You made me do it. And I believed that. That was a root belief that I created in myself. And then everything that happened after that, it was my fault. I was to blame. I was the bad one. And I punished myself. Sometimes I would punish myself even before the bad thing happened because I knew it was going to be my fault anyway. So now I can look back and I can say, hey, it wasn't my fault. I wasn't to blame. I was just a 6-year-old. And I can re-nurture myself. I can give myself permission not to blame myself at that point. Judith Herman does say that this stage is optional. Some people don't need that stage. And then here's another stage that, especially in our social services, we have not necessarily paid enough attention to, and it's a future orientation. Judith Herman calls it reconnection. And what she says specifically, it's reconnection and forgiveness of yourself for everything that you had to do in order to survive. You did it to survive. You can give yourself credit for that. There's a strength there. There's a lot of skill and ability there to be obedient, for example. In certain circumstances, that's a good thing to know how to do. But to fight is also a pretty good skill that sometimes is good to know how to do. It's also in this stage that we can reconnect. By forgiving myself, I can connect with others and risk that connection. Because in connecting, I'm losing a little bit, I'm taking a risk. You might not like me. You might say something I don't like. You might abandon me again. I don't know. And it is actually in this third stage that Judith Herman says trauma is resolved. Not in the establishment of safety, although that is helpful, and for some people that's all they need to resolve the trauma. Not necessarily in the talking about the past, although that is helpful, and some people do resolve trauma there. But Judith Herman says that it is actually in the ability to risk, again, that trauma is resolved. So what are we talking about here? Well, I'm going to suggest we're talking about safety, primarily. Everybody needs it, no matter where you were born, no matter how old you are, no matter what race you are, no matter what sexual orientation you are, we all need safety. Every single one of us needs safety, physical and emotional safety, for our brain to function, for our full human body to function. We need safety. And for those of you who were here last year, I talked about complex trauma using this very graphic. And that the way that we can understand complex trauma or developmental trauma disorder is that it starts with an unsafe home base. Now, this unsafe home base is often unsafe in and of itself, but sometimes it's the community or the society that creates the conditions for this unsafe home base. The unsafe home base is, however, what the kid is born into, and our brain has a mission, which is to help us survive in the actual circumstance in which we've been born. Not an ideal circumstance, but the real circumstance. And so kids develop, we all developed strategies to survive that unsafe home base. What are some strategies that kids develop to survive their unsafe home base? Withdrawing, but also acting out. What else? Sniffing glue. Well, yes, I'm going to suggest that might come after a couple of other strategies have been developed, but sniffing glue definitely is one that they eventually come to. But somebody once eloquently said that children develop strategies to either become bigger or to become smaller. And they make sense. I survived. And in my home base, I figured that everybody has that same kind of home base, basically, because that's all I know. But then I survived my unsafe home base long enough to end up going outside of the home on a regular basis. And what is the most typical place that most kids end up on a regular basis outside the home? School. And here I'm going to suggest is the moment when complex or developmental trauma becomes very complex. Up till now, I was like, hey, that's life. Everybody has this life. Everybody has parents like this or non-parents like this. And these strategies work. Look, here I am surviving. I get to school and I realize two things. One, not everybody's home was like that. That there was something maybe particularly strange about my home. And that my strategies that helped me survive now are doing what? Getting me in trouble. And folks, what is the most common way that a child reconciles this confusion, which is a biologically uncomfortable state to be in? If I develop strategies to survive this home, but now I'm getting in trouble about these strategies, and I thought this home was pretty much how everybody's life was, but I'm discovering it's not, and I'm confused about what's going on, what is the most common way that most children resolve this confusion? They blame themselves. There is something seriously wrong with me. And the internalization of that trauma happens. Now I carry the trauma with me no matter what's going on. Then that kid who was raised in the unsafe home base developed these strategies that are now working against him, and this belief that there's something seriously wrong with me gets exacerbated by the interventions themselves. And if you're working in the social services, this implicates all of us. Punitive and shaming interventions that exacerbate the unsafe behavior and alienate the child from help and helpers, perhaps for the rest of their lives. What are some examples of punitive and shaming interventions that exacerbate the unsafe behavior, make it worse, and alienate children from help and helpers, perhaps for the rest of their lives? Yeah. Limiting their contacts with friends. Absolutely. Isolation, ostracization, isolation. Sure. What else?
Putting them on different educational tasks, pulling them out of class for...
Pulling them out of class. Gabby, it's time for you to go and see the counselor. Everybody's looking at me. There goes Gabby. Going to see that counselor because there's something seriously wrong with her. Absolutely. What else? Yeah. Kicking them out of treatment for being, quote, non-compliant, which is really the basis of this whole conversation right here. Absolutely. This kid's not helping himself, so he can't even, we're not even going to help him. Nice. Yeah.
I said conditioned compliance, so I think she said the same thing.
Yeah.
Conditioned compliance.
And what we often see, I notice this with a lot of programs, that they have these rules, you will come on time. You will come on time, you will sit in your chair, you will, do this and you will do that. Well, folks, if the kid could do that or the adult could do that, they probably wouldn't need your service in the first place. These are outcomes. These are outcomes. But we actually require them as prerequisites. Punitive and shaming. They actually exacerbate the situation. There's something seriously wrong with me, clearly. Look, I got kicked out of a treatment program for at-risk youth. There must be something seriously wrong with me. And that alienate the child from help and helpers. So people who don't want help, who refuse help, who don't want to engage in your services, they are telling you a complex trauma story. Help was a bait and switch game. Or you can also see individuals, and maybe we ourselves have this opinion, that people who are help have some sort of ulterior motive. That they're in it for a reason, for a gain, for a purpose. Better to be suspicious, not engage. However, that child, coming from an unsafe home base, feeling that there's something seriously wrong with them, encountering help that is punitive and shaming, that makes the problem worse, these kids need help anyway. Everybody needs help. And what we see is that kids and adults end up engaging in what are objectively unsafe dynamics that, however, feel safe and accepting. What are some examples of objectively safe dynamics that, however, feel safe and accepting? Gangs. Drugs. Violent relationships. Suicidal behavior. Self-harm. Overworking. Just saying. And what we often see is that these unsafe dynamics, looking at not this one, but the unsafe dynamic, that these unsafe, objectively unsafe dynamics, commercial sexual exploitation, right, often end up in another child being born into another unsafe home base, and we've got this whole cycle happening all over again. So what I'm going to suggest is we want to understand that dynamic so that we can see what we're trying to actually do in a trauma-informed intervention. So first and foremost, we want to create a physically and emotionally safe home base. Wherever you are, wherever your client is, wherever this child is right now, let's increase safety in the home. Safety in the home. Physical and emotional safety in the home. Right now, today. Let's look at how do we talk to ourselves? How do we talk about ourselves? How does our clients, how do these kids talk to themselves on the inside? Is it harsh? Is it punitive? Is it violent language on the inside? I don't need anybody to abuse me if I'm talking to myself like that on the inside. I'm abusing myself. I've internalized trauma. So increase safer, more compassionate, nicer, softer, nicer talk to self. What's a common harsh statement that you've heard children or your clients or yourself say?
I'm so
I'm so stupid. I'm bad. I did it to myself. It's all my fault. Nobody will like me. What's wrong with me? I deserved it. I caused it. I deserved it. I made it happen. It's me. I'm the problem. So we want to notice this because this is, I'm going to suggest, the complex part of complex trauma. It's the internal part. We can physically make someone safe, right? We could take them from homelessness into a shelter or into transitional housing or into permanent housing. But if they're beating themselves on the inside, they've brought the trauma with them. And then we'll say, what's wrong with you? Why are you hoarding all this stuff? Why are you still sleeping in the park and just using your house as a storage unit for all your stuff? What's wrong with you? So we need to also be careful in our own lives how we're talking to ourselves, that we can carry that trauma with us as a result. So can we dial it down just a little bit, I'm not so stupid. I'm not the most stupid person in the world. There must be somebody out there stupider than me. And maybe from there, that little breath of compassion, maybe, I'm kind of smart. Sometimes I'm smart. I can get things some of the time. And then we can see the transformation. It doesn't have to go from I'm so stupid, I'm so ugly, nobody likes me, everybody hates me, to I'm wonderful, I'm lovable, and everybody loves me all the time. That there's, a range of compassion. We also want to be realistic. Not everybody loves me, but some people do. And then here, we were implicated in the negative. Now we can be implicated in the positive. Safe, non-punitive, non-shaming, non-violent interventions that actually reduce the problematic behavior. The reduction of the problematic behavior is a reflection that our intervention is working. If the problematic behavior is going up, traditionally, it's a reflection on how bad that kid is. But nope, it's actually a reflection that this intervention is just simply not working with this kid at this time. We have to try something else. So if it's going down, our intervention is working. If it's going up, our intervention isn't working. We need to switch it up. And we want to emphasize safe social dynamics that feel safe and accepting, that are, however, objectively safer than commercial sexual exploitation recruiters, also known as pimps, substance use, suicide, self-harm, gangs, violent relationships. It's not that high of a threshold, just more safe than that, but that feels safe and accepting. And then from there, a child that's born into a safe home base. And then we can start a process of not only in this generation healing, but for future generations as well. And what I'm going to suggest for all of us in order to do any of these things, in order to create safety in the home base, in order to create safer self-talk, in order to create safer interventions, in order to create safer social interactions, we need to focus on these neurobiological self-regulatory skills. First and foremost, 100% in the case of the guy who said 100%, 80%, 50%, however much that this is an issue, we need to start building in this practice probably much, 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 much more than we're currently doing. I'm going to suggest that grounding is a very easy, inexpensive, as a matter of fact, free technique to reduce intense negative emotion, to start to develop the skill of internal self-regulation from intense, or what we can call unsafe, to safer. I'm going to come back to this slide in a second. For the grounding, and if grounding isn't a word that your clients, it sounds like grounded, you're grounded, you're punished. If grounding is not a word that resonates with your clients or with yourself, just switch it up. Anchoring, centering, orienting, becoming aware, becoming present, whatever works. But I use the word grounding, and I use the image of a ladder. Being practical with kids helps, but frankly, being practical with adults helps too. And so if I am on the ground, I'm grounded. Here I am. I'm pretty stable. If somebody tries to push me over, it's going to be kind of difficult. And even if they do manage to push me over, it's a relatively short trip to the floor. But as I go up the ladder, I become less stable. It becomes more dangerous. And what does it say at the very tippy top of a ladder? It says, do not step here, danger. Who here in this room has actually stepped on the very top, tippy top ladder, step of a ladder? It's dangerous, isn't it? It's like, oh. And we can ask our kids in our classroom, our kids in our after-school program, our kids in our own home, have you ever felt emotionally like you were at the tippy top of a ladder? Who here has ever found themselves at the tippy top emotionally of that ladder? Unsafe, unstable. So grounding is the technique of learning for yourself, developing the confidence in yourself, that if I go up, I know how to come back down again. Rather than this sense of, when I go up, I don't know what the heck to do, and either emergency services have to call, or I have to fling myself off, or I have to stay up here forever, or I have to engage in some sort of unsafe strategy in order to deal with it. So going back to that slide, grounding, however you want to call it, is a process of detaching from overwhelming emotional pain, reducing, coming back down to the ground. It's useful directly with trauma triggers, intense triggering conditions like substance abuse or PTSD or anything that's a triggering kind of thing. But it's also useful when you're experiencing conflict, judgment, a time crunch, or a fear of being blamed. So in a certain sense, all of these feelings that I'm assuming most of us would consider negative, conflict, judgment, time crunch, fear of being blamed, getting in trouble, these negative emotions are trying to communicate something to us. They're desperately, desperately, desperately trying to tell us something. What are these negative emotions trying to tell us? That we're becoming unsafe. That the situation is becoming unsafe. They're trying to help us become safer. They're telling us, hey, so we can even say thank you, judgmental self-talk. Thank you very much. Harsh sense of how crappy this person is right here, for reminding me that things are getting unsafe and that I can notice, is it really unsafe, physical safety, or does it feel like it's unsafe, emotional safety? Grounding is present focused, right here, right now, right here, right now. It's also concrete and externally focused. Colors, senses, sounds. It doesn't have to be silent to do grounding. As a matter of fact, the noisier it is, the more stuff you can ground to. The train going by, or the buzz of the air conditioning thing. These are all senses that we can orient to. Taste, sound, all of our five senses. Balance, as a matter of fact. If you want to experiment at any point, if you notice yourself saying bad things to yourself or your child or whatever, try to balance. You'll have a hard time balancing. If you want to balance, we have to focus on that, not on the negative thought. And it's also, I'm going to suggest, very good for children who are having crying fits. Is that a nonviolent parenting word, crying fits? I had tantrums there, so I changed it to crying fits. Who are crying in an overwhelmed way, who are having a hard time breathing, who are overwhelmed, or who are numbed out. That grounding becomes the key skill for this internal locus of control, this internal self-regulation. If my child is over 2, and I wasn't as attuned or safe a parent, or that person didn't have an attuned, safe parent before the age of 2, I can still focus on this skill at age 3, at age 10, at age 15. And I can focus on it with myself. Because in order for me to attune to my child and help my child to self-regulate, I have to attune to myself. I have to regulate myself. It's in the doing that we show our children what to do. So we look around the room and we notice all the colors. Well, let's do it right now on a scale of 0 to 10 using our scaling system. And if your kids don't like 0 to 10 or your clients don't like 0 to 10, any scale, temperature, sunny weather, stormy weather, whatever it is, song titles, it doesn't matter. Halfway point is the distinction between safe and unsafe, the halfway point. So let's rate ourselves right now silently. On a scale of 0 to 10, how bad do you feel right now? Answer silently. If it's below a 5, consider agitating yourself just to see if grounding actually works. Otherwise, you're already grounded. Grounding doesn't do much. It's in the intensity that grounding works. So have a look around the room. Name silently to yourself all the colors that you see. How many exits are there? How many PowerPoint panels are there? Have a look at the table in front of you. Name all the objects that you see. Notice, perhaps in that bucket, some object, any object at all. Pick up an object. There's a nice bucket with a whole bunch of fun objects that adults don't feel permission to look at, but kids would have gotten into a long time ago, huh? You do not need permission. Pick up an object. How much does that object weigh? What material is it made out of? Does it make a noise? Does it have an odor? If it's edible, does it have a taste? Notice everything you can about this object. Putting the object down or not, continue on, do whatever you want, you are in control of yourself. Consider twisting gently to the right in your chair. Breathing. Twisting gently left. Breathing. Do that, if that feels good, do that a couple more times. If you want to, notice the chair that you're sitting in. Is your back up against the backrest? Are your feet firmly planted on the floor? Are you comfortable? Do you feel supported in your chair? Would you like to stand up? Would you like to have a stretch? These are all things that kids want to do constantly. And what do, at least traditionally, what do we say to kids when they're doing these things? We are teaching dysregulation rather than regulation. So I'm going to suggest that bringing in grounding into our parenting, bringing in grounding into our own life, bringing in grounding into our homes, bringing in grounding into our interventions, and helping our clients to bring grounding into their own social circumstances so that we can engage this internal self-regulatory locus of control rather than these external loci of control where I just don't have as much control. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, Dr. Vince Felitti kind of sums the whole thing up by saying what is conventionally viewed as the problem is actually a solution to a prior, often unrecognized adversity. But we're calling it the problem. So, for example, traditionally, domestic violence, right? What's the problem? The violence. Traditionally, what's the solution? Leave. And when a person leaves a violent relationship, are all their problems solved? No. In many ways, their problems have just begun. So the violent relationship was actually a solution to a prior adversity, often unrecognized. And so when I leave the violent relationship, I'm solving that problem, but I'm also undoing the solution that that relationship was a solution to, and a whole host of new problems. So it turns out that there is no one perfect solution to any problem. There are multiple solutions to every problem, and every solution has some problems that go along with it. And so rather than finding the perfect solution, ADHD kid, medication. As we all know, medication does not solve all the problems, and the problems associated with the medication might actually be worse than the original problem was. So now we're looking, is this solution working or not? And if it's not working, let's find other solutions. There's a hopefulness to this, that there are multiple solutions, not just one. Medication might help, but there might be new problems. So rather than being flummoxed and oh no, this is never going to work, I can say, well, what can help these problems? Or maybe this medication or whatever this solution was is not worth it. As a matter of fact, we have a word, a pretty fun word, I think, that means that the cure is worse than the problem. Anybody know this word? Pharmacide? Curing a problem with the illness. Interesting. Pharmacide. I actually don't know this word. That wasn't the word I was thinking of, but pharmacide is also. There are multiple words to describe this phenomenon. I was thinking, yeah. Iatrogenic. That's right. Iatrogenic. A lot of our interventions are iatrogenic. Iatrogenic. I-A-T-R-O, iatro, G-E-N-I-C, right? Iatrogenic, meaning that the cure ended up being worse than the original problem. That, like I had a headache, I took some medication, and it gave me kidney disease. It was iatrogenic. A lot of our interventions are iatrogenic because I'm going to suggest that we're trying to find the perfect solution to that problem. And I recently went to a locked facility, a level 14 locked facility for kids who are ED, emotionally disturbed, which is a terrible label, emotionally disturbed. A level 14 facility, and this young woman had been doing well. They had found a solution to the problem, right? She was doing well. Then she had a setback, and all hope was lost. What I'm going to suggest is, even when we find a solution to a problem, let's keep on finding more solutions. Because let's think about it. If I use substances for trauma, is that a common way that people deal with trauma? They use substances? What substance? I mean, there's a lot of them, but just give me a... Okay, I'm going to use meth. So if I use meth to solve trauma or things related to trauma, it solves some problems, right? And then it eventually becomes a problem, right? And our solution traditionally is stop using the meth. But what I'm going to suggest is that what our social services often do is that they also try to find the perfect solution. But I'm relying on that meth, and I'm not learning any other skills, and then eventually my meth abandons me. The help that the meth had abandons me. But similarly, even in our social services, doing whatever it's doing helps, but if I rely on that one skill alone, even though it's helping, it eventually abandons me, just like the meth help abandoned me. So even if we find something that works, let's keep on keeping on, that there are multiple solutions. Let's build upon it so that we don't then feel, oh no, it doesn't work anymore. That's just like substance abuse. So I'm going to suggest that it is through these unsafe and unproductive behaviors that we are often seeing trauma but not necessarily identifying. Hopefully now starting to identify it. So traditionally we've looked at events. We ask people, have you ever been? Have you ever seen? Has this ever happened to you? Some people disclose, some people don't disclose. In your own experience, have you ever asked a person about traumatic events knowing perfectly well, like you have a CPS report, for example, knowing perfectly well that there was a traumatic event and the person says, no, there was no traumatic event? Happens a lot. Like, this kid is a cognitive disorder, early onset Alzheimer's, malingering. What's wrong with this kid right here? So what we say from a trauma-informed approach is we ask, they do not have to tell. And before I ask anything, I say, you don't have to tell me anything. It's your story, and it's up to you to disclose. It might be helpful, but you don't have to. But traditionally, if a professional asks a question, what's the purpose of the question? To get the answer. The purpose of the question is to get the answer. From a trauma-informed perspective, the purpose of the question is to help, to connect, to give information. They may or may not tell us. It might take some time it might take some safety to figure it out. We're also going to look at symptoms of trauma. But folks, what do you think is the most common trauma symptom disclosed by actual trauma survivors? Headaches. That's right. Not flashbacks, not intrusive negative thoughts, not hypervigilance, not nightmares, not anger, not substance abuse, not all those things, but headaches. That a lot of people disclose the physiological, what we could call biomedical symptoms of trauma, and we're not connecting it to trauma, psychological trauma, interpersonal trauma, developmental trauma disorder. So we're going to educate people, but mainly ourselves, on symptoms. That these physiological symptoms, backaches, headaches, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, what's their connection to trauma? It turns out that they're very connected to trauma. And we're also going to look at unsafe behaviors as a disclosure of trauma. Traditionally, we rely on people's memory and people's vocabulary and temporal awareness to treat trauma. When people's temporal awareness, their memory, and their language skills are dramatically affected by trauma. We're asking people to use some of the areas that they're most struggling with to treat a condition that they're struggling with. So, unsafe thoughts, I want to die, I want everybody else to die. Unsafe behaviors, cutting, burning, running away, not going to school, all the range of unsafe behaviors. And unsafe relationships are all telling us the trauma story. It's an identification of trauma. I don't have to hear the trauma story. In order to address trauma, what we are going to do, and what Janina talked about yesterday so beautifully, is we're going to look at what makes sense. How the productive, the purposeful, and even the safety inside the unsafe behavior. What makes sense of the noncompliance? What makes sense of the opposition? What makes sense of the rule breaking? What makes sense of the not going to school? What makes sense? What real need is being met by the substance use? What real need is being met by being in a violent relationship, engaging in an eating disorder, having massive amounts of plastic surgery? What makes sense about that behavior? Rather than the traditional approach, what's the matter with you? Why do you need all that plastic surgery? But what makes sense? And then from connecting what makes sense, maybe we can help them find a pathway towards safer alternatives. Not just one, the perfect alternative, but multiple and multiple and more and more and more. So that I have a menu of options to deal with a variety of situations, and I can select from them given this unique opportunity. Rather than, here's what you need to do. You need to do this every single time. It's eventually going to abandon me. I'm going to overuse this one skill. And by making sense of myself, I'm able to make sense of other people too. If I think I'm out of control, crazy, lazy, that there's something seriously wrong with me, what am I going to think about the rest of the world? Exact same thing. It's a bunch of out of control people who are dangerous, and I have to protect myself at all costs from you. So the more I understand myself, the more I understand everybody else, the more I can get along. So if you look in your packets, you are going to find, in English and Spanish, 84 safe coping skills from the evidence-based practice Seeking Safety. I'm going to invite you on a voluntary basis, you do not have to do this, to pull out that safe coping skill sheet. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do very quickly. Look at that rule that we wrote down that's broken. Think of whoever's breaking this rule and try to see what makes sense on the list of these 84 safe coping skills. What is the safe coping skill inside the behavior of breaking that rule? So if the rule is no cell phones, and somebody is sneaking cell phones in and texting right now, what makes sense? Reach out to community resources, number 76, I think. That what we want to do first is we want to see what is the real need being met. It's often not just one, there's multiple. But what makes sense? How much time do I have? Okay, great. Oh, wow. Okay. Great. So does anybody want to say out loud the rule that's commonly broken? Raise your hand if you do. Anybody? Sure. What's the rule? Children must be. Is this a domestic violence shelter agency? I love this rule. This is a very common rule. Children must be supervised. Children must be supervised at all times. Usually it's the parents must be supervising their children at all times, right? So when you go into a domestic violence shelter, there is an expectation that you will be connected to the hip to your child 24 hours a day, constantly. Otherwise, you will be in trouble. You might even be kicked out because you're not a safe mom. Where's your child? So looking at the safe coping skills sheet, what is the real purpose, or one of many real purposes, that the mother, let's assume, that the mother is engaging in when she leaves her child unsupervised? Call out that number.
60.
Number 60. Detach from emotional pain. Distance. We say don't hit your kid in the domestic violence shelter. Don't we say that? No corporal punishment will be tolerated in this domestic violence shelter. Is that not a common rule? Okay, so I can't do that, so I'm going to walk away. Oh, now I'm in trouble. What? I'm in a trap. What else? 75. Can you read it out loud? Fight the trigger. Do anything that you can. Absolutely. But then I get in trouble. Is it safe? Is it unsafe? Am I safe? Am I unsafe? One more. Leave a bad scene. I'm going to leave a bad scene. So what we're going to try to do, and I'm going to suggest using this list is a very, very effective, safe, non-judgmental way, non-punitive, non-shaming way. It makes sense that you want to detach from emotional pain, take a little bit of time, not use some of the strategies that you've used in the past that you're going to get in trouble for using, that you want to leave a bad scene. Walking away from your kid is one way to do that. Maybe there might be some safer ways to do that too, but what I'm going to suggest is maybe the rule itself is unreasonable. So essential in what we're going to do, we're going to come back to all of this in a second. Essential for us to do this work, safety work, we can call it. I'm now calling it, in 2014, I'm calling it deep safety. In order to do this deep safety work, it's deep, people, but traditionally we just jump right over that level in Maslow's, don't we? Safety, oh yeah. Self-actualization, that's where I want to be. Instead, we want deep safety. If we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which we all have imprinted into our brains, deep safety is these roots of safety. Deep, deep safety. So there's two safeties that we're talking about. We're talking about physical safety and emotional safety. I have attempted to define these two safeties. If you do not like this definition, change it. Make it your own definition. This is my valiant attempt to define these things. Physical safety is the expectation of physical integrity and the absence of physical threat or harm. Now. There's a time frame to it. Right now, in the right now. Emotional safety is the expectation of respect and the absence of humiliation. So physical safety is something that, especially if we're parents or if we are in charge of other people, we are kind of legally bound to consider physical safety issues, right? And physical safety issues are urgencies or emergencies. They're right now. Imminent, immediate, right now. If I'm a CPS worker, a safety assessment is the child being abused? A risk assessment, what's the risk of abuse? Risk assessment has a future orientation to it. Safety is a right now thing. We want action, and we need action. We need direction. We need clarity. We need to know what to do. As a matter of fact, if you belong to a big state organization, you'll have like a safety officer in each floor who gets to wear like a little badge. Anybody here, your identified safety officer in case of an emergency? Anybody here? Okay, there they are. They're all over there. All the safety officers. Folks, if something happens right now, look at those people. Because we want authority. When things go wrong, we want someone, everybody go this way, and then we're going to go. I'm not going to be like, I'm not going to go with you. No, I'm going to go this way. I'm going to go straight this way. No, I'm going to go where I'm told in an emergency, where some building is falling down, earthquake is happening, fire is raging. And as a matter of fact, if I'm a lifeguard or a firefighter or a police officer, and there is a physical safety issue, shit is going down, and you're resisting me, I have every right to knock you over the head and drag you out. Is that not right? And you'll probably thank me afterwards, right? I mean, not guaranteed, but probably. If I'm a lifeguard and I go and the person is, I knock them out, don't I? In order to bring them to safety. I mean, hopefully it doesn't happen, but I get a right to do that, and you probably will thank me afterwards because I saved your life. But, you know, what if you're out there and you're on a raft and you're smoking a marijuana cigarette, and I swim out there and knock you over the head and drag you back to shore? Are you going to thank me? Are you going to thank me for that? No. You're going to sue me. So physical safety is something that is right now. We want rules or agreements or guidelines or laws or regulations to avert disaster. We want to prevent that situation. I don't want to have to knock everybody out in order to get you out of this room. But We need procedures to recognize and respond to disaster, not reasserting the rule. So, for example, in seeking safety and evidence-based practice that I train and conduct, the model says no graphic detail of past trauma. So I was listening to an adherence tape, and a wonderful, very empathetic, lovely facilitator started to notice that this person was going into past detail. And what she said was, in this group, we don't go into past graphic detail. Not helpful. Instead, what Seeking Safety says is that upon inadvertent disclosure of past graphic detail, we ground down. I don't shame the person by reasserting the rule. You broke the rule. That's not helpful. The rule has already been broken. We need a procedure to reestablish safety, which in this case would be grounding. If you're a kid and you sneak a cigarette into your group home and you cause a fire in your room, we go in there, what? You're smoking? You're not supposed to be smoking. No, it doesn't even make any sense. We have to put out the fire. Now, compare that to emotional safety. Emotional safety is making choices, making change, doing behaviors differently, looking at relationships. And there are choices, there are options. There's not just one way to quit smoking. There are a multitude of ways to quit smoking. Who here has successfully quit smoking? Raise your hand. Nicely done. First of all, round of applause. Raise your hand if you went cold turkey. Raise your hand if you used an anti-smoking medication. Raise your hand if you dwindled it down. Raise your hand if you use a patch. Raise your hand if you use hypnosis. Raise your hand if you, what else? Acupuncture. Acupuncture. There are multiple ways to reduce it. There are options, there are choices. And so what we want is we want agreements to create safe collaboration, and then we're going to address unsafe behaviors by focusing on safety. And when the individual smokes again, when the individual relapses, when the individual breaks the rule, or the agreement in this case, breaks the agreement, we're going to be curious. I wonder why. What happened? What are the strategies? We talked about in our early breakfast with Gabby that the setback is an opportunity for recovery. And if we think about the plasticity, the neuroplasticity of the brain, we're rewiring, right? We're rewiring the brain. Well, when I have a setback, I now have an opportunity to rewire the brain. But sometimes, at least traditionally, we throw up our hands in desperation when we have a setback. My kid is doing good. He has a setback. Oh, no! No, the setback is the awesome moment when we get to rewire the brain. If we understand what it is and react with a safety orientation rather than hysteria. I'm just going to point out that the California Civil Code actually says that your rules must be reasonable. Now, I'm not sure if this is talking about our home rules, but it's definitely talking about your agency rules. That our rules have to be reasonable. First of all, they have to respect the Constitution of the United States. And if your rules do not respect the Constitution of the United States, you can be sued. They also have to be consistent with applicable federal, state, and local statutes. And if they're not, you can be sued. What is the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution? What does it say? What does it say? Freedom of self-incrimination. Freedom from self-incrimination. How many agencies require force self-incrimination? Let's think about that. Call your lawyers immediately. Inflexible restrictions are often unreasonable. Inflexible restrictions are often unreasonable. Rules should provide options. The California Civil Code says that. And you've got all the other ones if you're interested. So put in trauma-informed language, moving away from the California Civil Code. What we're going to say is that rules should be safety-oriented, physical safety-oriented. Otherwise, they're agreements. Now, think about the work that you do. What percentage of your work is life and death, imminent risk of life? What percentage? Or injury? 10%? Less than 10%? So your rules should only be focusing on that area. Everything else is agreements. In this program, we ask people to be substance-free. Would you be willing to be substance-free during this program? Nope, I am not willing to do that. Excellent point. As a matter of fact, it's an unreasonable expectation. However, that's what we are asking you to do. So let's see if we can't find some other alternatives, because in this program, we're going to insist on substance-free stuff. So we're going to be safety-oriented. And here's the twist, is that it is the safety of the individual that you have very much in front of you, nobody else's safety, that we're going to be addressing. If I am a probationer, and you are a probation officer, the probation officer says, for public safety, Gabby, you must abide by all the laws and not associate with known criminals and not use substances for public safety. Is this not a common thing that probation officers say? Nope, that is actually unreasonable, and therefore you can be sued, probation officer, or at least the probation department can, because you're only responsible for your own behavior. The probationer's behavior is the only thing the probationer needs to be worrying about. He doesn't need to be worried about public safety. That's the probation officer, the probation department's job. If I am in a classroom, how many teachers say, for all the kids' safety, you have to, whatever it is that the kid has to do. I am holding this kid responsible for everybody else's safety. Well, then I should be paying him the teacher's salary. If I'm going to, burden this kid with every other kid's safety, then he should be paid at least something for all that responsibility. Nope, you are responsible for your behavior. And if you behave in an unsafe way, I'm going to address that unsafety with you. And what do kids and even probationers often say? Billy made me do it. It wasn't my fault. I was just walking by. That's when that happened. Well, I'll talk to Billy about Billy, but I'm going to talk to you. When Billy does these kind of things, what can you do? What will you agree to do when Billy does these things? I'm going to hold you accountable for your behavior, nobody else's safety or behavior. I'm also going to make my rule positively framed, what to do, not just what not to do. I'm going to offer some choices, some options. I'm going to emphasize this person's safety and success. I'm going to get in touch with the kid's goal, or the probationer's goal, or the victim of domestic violence goal, or the teacher's goal, whoever I'm working with. Get in touch with their goal and see how not complying, but abiding by their agreements will help them achieve their goal. What is a common goal that kids have? Not to get in trouble. Very nice. Be able to go on the outing. Let's get in touch with what the kid is. And, if you are able to do these kind of things, it'll help you be able to achieve your goal. If you are able to abstain from substances for 30 days, there's a better likelihood that you're going to get off probation. Get that probation officer off your back. Stop doing mandatory testing. Be able to get a job. Be able to complete school. And then we're going to offer respect through agreements. Do we often have rules, especially for kids, you will respect others? Well, it's through agreements that we're going to create that respect. And I'm going to emphasize that if and when you show non-respect towards somebody else, it's actually a demonstration that you don't respect yourself. And I'm going to emphasize how you can respect yourself and develop respect. Is that something that you'd like to do? Is that something you'd like to try? So we're going to have this invitational approach, and we're going to be curious, to use Janina's word from yesterday. When they say no, some people like to say no just to see how we react to that. Are we going to fling all of our values and all of the mission statements, into the wind as soon as somebody says, no, I don't agree to that? Why not? What would you be willing to agree to? Would you like some more information? So in order to make rules work, they have to be clear, or as clear as possible, and as warm as possible. I just went over all this stuff. If it's a legal requirement, here's what I say. State the law specifically I often go to places and it's the law, they have to do that. Where's the law? Show me the law. What's the law? There is no law. We just bandy about this word. It's the law. What I also say is, if you bend a rule, you can usually throw that rule away. And we usually bend rules for people we like, or who have disclosed and told us a sad story, or who have given us some sort of, positive reinforcement of things that we're desperately in need of. Then I bend the rule for this person. Oh, she this and he this, and it's okay, it's all right. The person who instead doesn't like me, the person who doesn't tell me what's up, oh no, I'm going to come down like a ton of bricks on that person. It's actually a form of bias, this rule bending. It's not compassionate. So looking at our rules, what we see is that most agencies, and maybe even some homes, often can't shift dramatically. And I'm not even going to suggest to shift dramatically. Let's take little steps to develop the skills to handle that little bit of change, and then encourage ourselves, gain the confidence to make a little more change. So this is an example of an original rule. It said, no violence. Physical fights between service partners or against any storefront staff will not be permitted. This includes, just in case you don't know what violence is, kids, direct verbal threats or actions that endanger service partners or staff. Is it clear? Kind of, yeah. Okay, no violence. I guess that's clear. Is it warm? Not really. No violence. This is a program serving homeless youth in San Diego. Do you think homeless youth in San Diego use violence? Yeah. So, I'm a bad person for using violence, or, what am I supposed to use? Oops. So they took one step. I agree not to use violence or threats of violence. However, if I do, I understand that the police may be called and I may be charged with a crime. Is that clear? It's clearer. Is it warm? Well, we've got a big old threat for police for homeless youth when they come into the shelter. Day treatment program, actually. So they moved one more. They saw what they were actually communicating. It was clearer, but it wasn't warmer. I agree not to use violence or threats of violence at the center. I have a right to protect myself using non-violent methods. The center can help me develop non-violent methods. Excuse that hyphen. The center can help me develop non-violent methods of self-protection. Is that warm? Is it clear? Does it give choices? Does it recognize a human need that violence serves, which is self-protection? Homeless kids aren't using violence because they're violent kids. They're using violence because they have to protect themselves. And in some circumstance, violence is the right way to protect yourself. But if I only use violence, eventually it abandons me. I need other skills to protect myself. So I'm not over-relying on this one. So as you can see, and I've provided several options, what I'd like you to do right now for 1 minute is look at your rule. Think about the reasons, the real needs that are being met by that individual or those individuals who are breaking it. Focus on safety. Is it a physical safety issue? Then it's a rule. Let's be clear. Let's try to be warm. Let's offer some options. Let's recognize the real need. If it's not a safety, physical safety issue, it's an agreement. And it probably shouldn't be in the rules section anyway. It should be in an agreement conversation as a part of informed voluntary consent, which is a legal mandate that we all have if we're accepting public money. So I'd like to thank you all.